and welcome to my channel. My fascination with cryptids began a few years ago when I was on vacation listening to my cousin tell stories about Bigfoot and Dogman. I started listening to and reading every story I could find about every type of cryptid. This led to me starting this channel so I could read these stories I find so fascinating. In this episode, I have a compilation of 5 stories involving unidentified cryptids. A couple of these stories, it seems pretty obvious what the storyteller was dealing with. The others, it isn't too clear. You'll want to stick around for the last 2 stories. One involves a girl being lured into the woods by the sound of her own mother's voice, only to realize it couldn't possibly be her mother. And the last story? Could you imagine having the side of your tent pushed in only to shine a flashlight on it and realize it's a face? But first, we start with a story from the Appalachian Mountains, where 2 boys have an unwelcome visitor watching them at their camp. If you are a hardcore believer, a skeptic with an open mind, or a non-believer, you are welcome here. I just ask that you keep it respectful in the comment section. No one should be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Alright, now let's get to today's stories. Our first story comes from a poster who lives in the Appalachian Mountains. The mountain range is a 1,500-mile long range that extends from Newfoundland, Canada, all the way through central Alabama in the United States. It is anywhere from 100 to 300 miles wide, and the highest group of mountains in the range are in North Carolina. Mount Mitchell is the highest peak not only in the Appalachian mountain range, but in the United States east of the Mississippi River. It's said that the mountains in the Appalachians used to reach as high as the Alps and the Rocky Mountains, but no longer do because of natural erosion. Our original poster, or OP, doesn't say exactly where he lives, but he lives on or near the range because he spent most of his childhood and teenage years exploring the range near his home and would venture farther and farther into the woods the older he got. He and his friends would leave forts and carvings in trees, extending the boundaries of their adventures. He never experienced anything in those woods, but that would all change after he graduated high school when he and his friends spent their entire last summer of freedom camping and hiking. Having spent most of their summer out there, they decided to find a new spot to camp, so they walked a few miles out, found a clearing in an area they weren't as familiar with, and set up camp. Our OP had never ventured this far out while camping and never camped alone, even as an adult. He always had the eerie, unsettling feeling that he was being watched. So there they are, camp set up, fire going, they're sitting around having a good time. His friend was sitting in a little chair he always brought, and he was crouched down, putting wood on the fire, when a sudden breeze came out of nowhere and blew the fire down to a small flame. It caught them so off guard that they froze, now in almost complete darkness. That's when they heard the footsteps in the woods across from where they sat. It sounded like someone would take off running, then slow down and walk before running again, back and forth over and over in the same small area. They could tell it was bipedal. Then the noise stopped and our OP heard the soft crunch of underbrush. By the sound of it, this thing had just crouched down. He was still crouched down by the fire looking into the dark woods, but somehow knew he was looking right at whatever this thing was. He was so fixated on the steps and the pattern of the running and walking back and forth, he hadn't even considered that this thing might be malicious. It wasn't until his friend reached over, placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Buddy," that the fear descended upon him in a surge that chilled him to the bone. He could hear and feel the fear in his friend's voice. It was a raw, primal fear that made him feel completely and utterly helpless as he watched the darkness for this creature that had taken up position right outside their camp. A rancid, disgusting smell had settled over the camp as well. Our OP describes it as smelling like a paper mill or spoiled eggs. His friend threw a pile of leaves onto the dying fire in an attempt to keep the flames burning, and in the brief moment the leaves covered the flames, they were engulfed in complete darkness. The fire then sprang back to life and they quickly threw more brush, leaves, and wood onto it to stoke the flames, eager to keep the area lit. They sat there staring at the shadow-covered spot where they thought the creature was for more than an hour before they once again heard the crunch of leaves and whatever this thing was walk away into the forest. When the footsteps eventually faded, so did the smell. Neither of them moved for the rest of the night. They sat watching the spot until dawn, with the OP getting very little sleep, his head propped in his hands, and his friend not sleeping at all. When morning came, they packed up camp and hiked back home in silence. They don't know what came to their camp that night, but they both know that what was out there had crouched down and sat still for longer than any animal could. Besides, it sounded bipedal, and then there was the rotten smell that came along with it. His friend, who is an avid outdoorsman and he describes as a forester who would camp alone all the time, hasn't camped by himself in the area in the 7 to 8 years since the incident. All signs, at least to me, point to this being a Sasquatch. Bipedal running and walking back and forth just outside camp, the pungent, rancid smell. But then again, there are other cryptids who exhibit this same behavior. What do you think it was? Our next story comes to us from Southern Ontario, Canada. The original poster, or OP, shares his girlfriend's story about what she saw watching her from the woods late one night. The couple has always enjoyed scary stories, but were both skeptics and never truly believed in the paranormal. That was before his girlfriend had an experience one night that left them wondering what she saw outside her friend's house. One night, when the topic of all things spooky came up, our OP joked with his girlfriend that he would never want to experience anything like that. She agreed with him, but he could tell by the way she answered that something was amiss. It was like she was speaking from experience. Upon further questioning, she revealed to him that she did have an experience one night involving something she cannot explain. That night, she was hanging out with her friend, who is also her next door neighbor, in a rural area in southern Ontario. The story doesn't say exactly where they lived, but it does say that they lived in an area surrounded by miles of forest. They were at her house and it was getting late, so she decided to walk her friend to the end of her driveway and wait until she entered her home. This was because she was on edge, feeling as though something wasn't right, so she just wanted to make sure that her friend got home safe. He doesn't say how far they had to walk, but his girlfriend's hair stood on end the entire time, especially while she stood watching her friend walk down her driveway to her house. After her friend was safely inside, her attention was drawn to the woods, where she says a pair of glowing eyes was looking in her direction. She recalls that the eyes were way too high up to be any normal animal. She could barely make out the being's silhouette in the tree line and said that the body was extremely thin. It stood still, not making a sound, watching her. The OP, being a skeptic, says that he had a hard time believing his girlfriend, wanting to dismiss what she saw as her eyes playing tricks on her or the like because she is an anxious person in general and it was late at night when this took place. Until he heard what she told him next. His girlfriend hurried home, but as soon as she got home, her friend called her and sounded shaken. Her friend isn't the kind of person who gets spooked easily. She told our OP's girlfriend about what she saw standing in the woods next to her home and described the exact same thing his girlfriend saw. Tall and thin, standing there silently, glowing eyes watching her. This is when the OP believed his girlfriend. It's one thing when one person sees something, but when two people who see something separately and describe it the exact same way, that's something else entirely. And all the proof he needed to believe her. And it shook him to his core. He believes it was a Wendigo. I can't say for sure what I think it is, as a lot of cryptids match that description. I'll leave it up to you to decide what you think it might be. The third story of this episode takes place in Northern Virginia, where the original poster lived from the years of 2000 to 2005. He lived on the southern edge of the area near Bull Run River, which is south of Clifton and just outside of Washington, D.C. It is a rural part of Virginia where the houses sit far apart from each other. The woods surrounding them are made up of somewhat dense foliage. Our OP had a bad habit of staying up really late at night due to his insomnia and would sometimes stay awake until dawn. He often left his window open so he can enjoy the cool night breeze. Sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, he would hear what sounded like something crashing through the woods behind his home. Whatever it was loud and sounded very large. The way the leaves rustled made him think it was something dragging their feet along the ground as they walked. The path whoever or whatever was taking behind his home was always the same. They would come from the direction of his driveway and walk like they were heading directly for the Bull Run River. He would hear the dragging of feet kicking up leaves and branches break as if the being was carelessly barreling through the area. He could never tell if it was just one being or several. However many there were, whatever was storming through the woods at night always caught his attention because of how loud it was. He came to expect the disruption every 2 weeks or so and would even glance out the window to see if he saw anything in the woods. But he never saw anything. No figures, no silhouettes, no glows or lights or anything. Absolutely nothing. Something odd that struck our OP as he began keeping up with the mysterious late-night disturbance was that the being or beings' path appeared to lead from nowhere to nowhere. It was like whatever was rampaging through the woods did so just for the sake of rampaging through the woods. Their destination? Deeper into the woods. Not to mention, they would do this in the dead of night with no light whatsoever. It made no sense to him. To further add to the mystery, one night when he heard the woodwalkers, as he calls them, they were accompanied by gunshots. This happened directly behind his house. He says it sounded like a handgun to him, but when he went out the next morning to search for evidence of this, he didn't find anything. And he saw no evidence that anyone had even walked through the woods. So, one particular evening, our OP's curiosity got the best of him when he heard these woodwalkers come barreling through the woods behind his house. He needed answers. He wanted to know exactly what they were. He shot up, changed into some jeans, and grabbed the flashlight he had stowed on the small dresser by the door. He then grabbed his pistol, went down through the basement, and headed out into the night. He says it took him way too long to get outside as the woodwalkers had traveled past his house and were venturing farther into the woods. He could still hear them though, as he drew the pistol he had tucked into his pants and cautiously crept down a hill into the woods, taking up a position behind a large tree. He searched for the beings in the direction of the noise but saw nothing. He waited a while, then pulled his flashlight out to illuminate the dark woods, but by that point he again saw nothing. Defeated, he listened to the sounds fade away, then returned to his home. He still wonders to this day what could have been making all that noise behind his house all those years ago. From the way he makes it sound with the trudging through the woods loudly, heavy footsteps, branches breaking, it makes me think it was a Sasquatch. But the gunshots he heard and the historical area he lived in, maybe he wasn't hearing a cryptid at all. In fact, there were 2 battles fought at Bull Run during the Civil War, including the first full-scale battle of the war. Perhaps he is hearing echoes of the soldiers storming across the battlefield from a battle once fought there. What do you think his woodwalkers could be? Sasquatch? Or the ghostly echoes of a battle fought long ago? Our next to last story is a perfect example of how these things try to lure people into the woods by mimicking a friend or loved one's voice. Except this time, our original poster didn't know any better and followed the voice. What ensued was truly terrifying, and she has not been back into the woods or any forest since. She was 15 years old at the time of her encounter and did not believe in anything supernatural or paranormal before the events of her story took place. She lives in North Carolina, with her tale taking place at a summer camp. She does not say exactly where the camp was or what area it was in. The day started off like any other day at the camp, nothing unusual or out of the ordinary. The campers were grouped by age, and her group had just finished lunch when they went down by the lake to play a game that they called Scatter. It is a rendition of the kids' game Hide and Seek, where the counselor yells scatter and everyone runs and hides in the woods. Everyone had grown up playing in the woods, so they all felt comfortable amongst the trees, and in the 2 weeks she had been at the camp, they had played this game approximately 20 times according to her, and nothing bizarre had happened to anyone. That is, until that day. When the counselor yelled scatter, she ran and found a hiding spot in the woods next to a huge, uprooted tree. The rule was they had to still be able to see the lake from where they hid. She could, so she lay down and waited to be found. About 5 minutes passed when she started hearing a voice calling her name. It was a beguiling sing-song voice sounding like it came from a dream. But it wasn't just any voice. It was a voice she knew very well. It was her mother. She is extremely close with her mother and would know her voice anywhere, and knew without a doubt that day it was her mom's voice calling her name. She also knew that it couldn't possibly have been her mother's voice. She was at work about 20 miles away, and even if she had come to pick her up early, the voice wasn't coming from the direction of the lake. It was coming from deeper in the woods, far beyond the camp's border. She knew she should have ignored the voice, perhaps even run back to the lake, but she found herself in a hypnotic, trance-like state as it continued to call out her name. She started to doubt logic and reason, finding herself thinking things like, "It could be my mom. Then, what if she's hurt? And finally, I have to go to her." The thoughts filled her head and overwhelmed her, pulling at her emotions as if manipulating her. Finally, they got the best of her and she took off running in the direction of her mother's voice. She ran deeper into the forest for about 5 to 7 minutes by her approximation, following the sound of this voice the entire time. It was when she reached a clearing that the voice ceased. She walked into the clearing and, no longer able to hear the voice, began thinking clearly once again. Then she was instantly on high alert and her internal alarm started going off. The thoughts of, "You idiot, that's not mom," and "run" now filled her head. But she didn't know which way to run. She wasn't sure which way she had come from and which way she should go to get back to the lake. Besides, she was exhausted. So, not knowing what else to do, she sat down to catch her breath. She had barely reached her sitting position when her internal alarms once again went off. She felt like she was being watched. That's when she heard the chittering sound. She describes it as sounding almost like someone's teeth chattering because they were cold. But if you've ever experienced a summer day in North Carolina, you know it gets very hot and very humid. There's no way someone was cold. She scanned her immediate area but saw nothing. But then she heard brush crunch on the edge of the clearing, a footstep. She knew then that she was being watched and she had been lured into the deep woods by whatever this thing was. It started circling the clearing. She felt like prey being hunted by a predator. The only thing she could think to do was take off running, so that's exactly what she did, in the direction she thought she had come from. She pushed herself to her limits, sprinting through the forest as fast as she could manage. The entire time she heard the chittering and the crunch of leaves and sticks under footsteps behind her. She did not look back. She couldn't bring herself to. She knew if she did, she'd slow down, and she absolutely could not afford to slow down. She can't say how long it took her to reach the lake, but it felt like forever to her. She burst out of the tree line and sprinted to where she knew her friends would be. Only then did she look back to see a figure retreating into the forest. She could still hear the chittering. She found her counselor and grabbed her in a hug, holding on for dear life. She was hysterical, but finally calmed down enough to tell her what happened. She asked her counselor if she had called her name, but she already knew the answer. It couldn't have been her. It was her mother's voice. Turns out, no one even knew she was gone. Everyone was still hiding. The game wasn't even over yet. The tactics of mimicking a voice to lure someone in the woods makes me think this could have been a couple of different cryptids. It certainly sounds like it might have been a Wendigo, but this also sounds like what a skinwalker would do too. The commenters seem to think it was one of these two. However, the chittering makes me think that it could have been something else. What do you think lured this poor girl into the woods? Our final story of this episode takes place in Grand Teton National Park, which is located in northwest Wyoming near the Idaho border. The park covers somewhere in the vicinity of 310,000 acres and includes the Teton Range, a 40-mile-long mountain range. The park also includes the northern sections of Jackson Hole, a valley that separates the Grand Tetons from the Gros Ventre mountain range. Grand Teton National Park is only 10 miles south of Yellowstone. The park is no stranger to mysterious and paranormal occurrences, including missing person cases, strange disappearances, and, of course, paranormal and cryptid activity. Our original poster set out on a 25-mile expedition in the Grand Tetons on her first backpacking trip with her boyfriend, now husband, who served in the military and is an avid outdoorsman. He majored in ecology and enjoyed spending time in the wilderness. Wanting to do more of that, he took our OP on her first backpacking trip. It would be just the two of them. She noticed the Grand Tetons are known for grizzly bear sightings, and being that she had no experience with bears, other than one occurrence where she saw a black bear from the safety of her car, she was on edge. The first of two encounters she and her husband had happened at the very beginning of their journey. They were no more than an hour into their trip when they were about to crest a particularly steep hill when she noticed that a stillness had engulfed the woods around them. Everything sat in complete silence. The only noise in the area was the rushing water from a stream to the left of the trail. She was in front of her husband and reached the hill's summit first. They had been too tired to talk for about 20 minutes, even though they both knew they should have been making noise to alert any potential bears of their presence and to prevent sneaking up on bears or any other wildlife. This is a general rule of thumb when camping and or hiking in an area known to have grizzlies. But lugging a 40-pound backpack up a steep incline will take your zest for conversation away, just as it did for our OP and her husband. They both noticed the stillness of the forest around them at the same time and gave each other a knowing, wary look. A silence like that usually denotes the presence of a nearby predator, or something else entirely. Our OP reached the top of the hill and froze. Sitting in the middle of the trail, not 10 feet in front of her, was a grizzly bear. Trying to alert her husband, she flailed her arm around behind her. She was too afraid to speak. The bear, not taking his eyes off them, stood up. Her husband reached the top of the hill, swung her around behind him, and started yelling at the bear. The grizzly, unfazed by the yelling, started walking toward them. At that point, terror had nearly overcome her, and she thought she might faint at any second. When the bear was about 5 feet from them, a loud crack to their right broke the silence. The bear immediately took off toward the stream as a second loud crack resounded in the trees, this one much closer than the first. Her husband tried to downplay the situation by telling her it was probably just some falling branches, but neither of them were buying that explanation. They hurried down the trail to put some distance between themselves and the bear and whatever was making those noises just off the trail. Our OP felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Her husband must have felt something too, because they both stopped at the same time and looked back down the trail. She says that she is still not sure what they saw. In the immediate area of their face-to-face encounter with the grizzly was a huge black figure. This thing was much bigger than the bear, at least 3 times the grizzly's size according to her. It had its back to the couple as it stood up on hind legs. It did look similar to the bear, but something about it just did not seem right. They took off running and could hear heavy footfalls behind them, but they didn't look back. They ran until they heard the footsteps fade away. Our OP was hysterical at this point, but her husband did his best to calm her, ensuring her what just happened was out of the ordinary and it wouldn't happen again. His consoling was enough to keep her going. They would have another encounter with a grizzly, this one a juvenile, about an hour later in a clearing, but her husband was able to scare it away. Their trip was not off to a great start, but what they encountered the first day was nothing compared to what happened to them on the second night. As is required by the park, before setting out on their backpacking trip, they stopped by the ranger station to let them know which trails they would be taking during their route. This let the rangers know approximately where in the park they would be, and a ranger would ride by on horseback to periodically check on them. As luck would have it though, the only trails available for them were the most difficult. Apparently, they were the only hikers on their chosen trail because they didn't see anyone else throughout the duration of their 3-day hike. The second day of the journey was filled with our OP having problems with her feet, and a lot of their time was spent stopping to try and adjust her footwear to try and alleviate the pain. They also missed the park ranger as they saw fresh hoof prints that weren't there the day before but did not see the ranger or his horse. By the time they got back to hiking after their final attempt to stop her foot pain, they didn't have much daylight left. An hour, maybe 2, to find a campsite. Our OP was exhausted and was not having the best time. Adding to this was the cold temperatures and the wind blowing, which created a howling sound, making it nearly impossible to hear anything else. And they had not yet eaten. They were forced to hike in the dark for about an hour before they found a clearing shaped like a bowl and had a diameter of an estimated 200 meters. The place felt strange. In fact, her husband did not let her know how freaked out he was by the area until after the fact. There was no moonlight, so the only source of light they had was from his headlamp. Hers had stopped working, a small camp stove, and a single flashlight. Many of the trees within the bowl-shaped clearing were either dead or had fallen. Outside the clearing was a different story though, as the vegetation was extremely dense. To try and help his future wife, her then fiancé cranked up some loud music which just echoed off the trees and created a discord of sound within the clearing. He also figured the sound would scare off nearby predators, if there were any in the area. Their anxiousness heightened then, and they realized that while they entered the clearing and set up camp, they hadn't heard a single bird. They turned off the music then, and the same unnerving silence that preceded their previous encounter had returned. They climbed into their tent and decided to try to get some sleep, but no sooner settled into their sleeping bags before they started hearing knocks thudding in the distance, along with the cracking of branches and limbs emanating from the forest beyond the clearing. It sounded like trees were falling. This, unfortunately, was not the case. The next thud they heard came from within the clearing. They froze. It was followed by another just outside their tent. She and her husband held their breath and reached for each other's hand, holding on tight, laying there paralyzed by fear. They saw something push against the side of the tent, dragging along the outside. It was thin, like a finger. Our OP was shaking but managed to ask her husband what he thought it was. He said he didn't know, but that it couldn't be a person. They were the only ones on that side of the mountain. She stifled sobs then, trying to listen to what was happening outside the tent. She heard footsteps but could not tell what they belonged to. The footfall stopped. Then something slowly started pushing against the tent as the entire side started moving inward toward them. Whatever was out there knew they were in the tent. She quickly grabbed her flashlight and shined it on the side of the tent wall to reveal something that made her blood run cold. There was a human-like face pressing against the side of their tent. She couldn't see a nose but saw an open mouth that pushed a portion of the tent in and out as it breathed. Her husband was done messing around. He grabbed his Glock from his sleeping bag and cocked it, the noise breaking the silence. Suddenly, the face pulled back and they heard footsteps moving hastily away from them and out of the clearing. They stayed in the tent until the sun came up, but when they did leave the tent, they were hit with a fresh smell of urine. Whoever or whatever had visited their camp the night before had urinated on the fire's coals, leaving a disgusting smell in the area. Footsteps encompassed their tent, looking to have circled it multiple times, and muddy handprints were smeared on the outside. Our OP's first backpacking trip was certainly one to remember. However, all that said, she said she would be up for doing it again, only this time she would want more people to go with them. This definitely sounds like Sasquatch behavior, and what they described seeing during their first encounter has the appearance of one. Either way, what a terrifying experience that must have been, to have a face pushing the side of your tent. I know they were both scared, but whatever this thing was didn't seem to have malicious intent. It seemed more curious than anything else. What it did to the fire though? Well, that's just insult to injury. What do you think visited these two hikers at their camp that night? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put my email in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an upcoming episode. Please just make sure that it is well written, uses punctuation, and is proofread. Thank you for listening. I will catch you at the next episode.